Welcome to the Green Alliance podcast. We are the charity and think tank dedicated to achieving ambitious leadership for the environment. I'm Alice Stafford, Communications Officer here at Green Alliance. Today, I'm joined by Molly Easton, Co-Director, and Layla Mapemba, Engagement Lead, both from Youngwilders, a youth-led non-profit focused on accelerating UK nature recovery and centering young people in the process. Youngwilders manage youth-led nature recovery projects and a creative program of events focused on upskilling and energising the next generation of environmental stewards across England and Wales. Rewilding is a growing movement in the UK and internationally. As we face accelerating biodiversity loss and habitat degradation, it offers us a long-term, ambitious approach to ecological recovery. Molly and Layla come to this chat today to share their insights on youth-led environmental action, making nature recovery more inclusive, and how grassroots work can influence broader policy change. Molly and Layla, thanks for coming onto the podcast to speak with me today. I wanted to start off with a really simple question, which is how would you explain rewilding to someone who's never come across the term, and what does it actually look like in practice on the ground?
Yeah, I'm happy to take the charge on this. If you've never heard the term rewilding and you Google it for the first time, you'll probably come across the kind of large-scale rewilding projects like Yellowstone in America or Nep Wildland in Sussex, where we actually do some work. And these ones are all about, they involve kind of restoring large tracts of land until nature can really take care of itself. So within that, it's about restoring habitats and reintroducing and restoring natural processes, and where appropriate, potentially missing species like the beaver or pigs, where these animals can create extraordinary habitats on their own, and they're often kind of seen as ecosystem engineers. So beavers are incredibly good at creating wetland habitats, for example. Obviously, that's quite large scale, so a kind of rewilding in its purest form does need scale. It needs enough space to allow nature to drive the changes. And that can come from single land holdings or where owners work together to create kind of the requisite size needed to let nature lead. At Youngwilders, we obviously operate on the smaller end of the spectrum, and I think we really want to give a shout out to small scale rewilding. Our projects vary in size from the size of a tennis court in central London to kind of 50 acres, which is also part of a larger kind of 3,000 acre estate. So that is potentially, we're kind of moving into the larger scale there. And for these projects, we really work with young people to be guided by rewilding principles and kind of in other forms like process-based ecological restoration. So thinking of ways and like actions we can take to make sure nature can lead the way, give it as much of a helping hand as it needs. So an example is at our site in Essex called Pants Hall. We led a day where everyone kind of dressed up like pigs and tried to mimic what a pig could do on a landscape. So that rootling effect of a pig's nose in the soil, turning over turf, reworking soils and sediments, and kind of potentially introducing new seed sources or allowing kind of bare ground for seeds to germinate. It's called biotubation, if you want the fancy term, and it's basically where we as humans mimic natural processes and try and where maybe that we don't have the necessary scale to have pigs full-time on a site.
That sounds like such a cool project. It's so interesting to hear it described. I do think rewilding is one of those things where even if people have heard of it and they might be really interested in it as a concept, there are still barriers in terms of accessibility and actually participating. You know, I imagine it might be really difficult if you're a young person and let's say you're in a city with minimal access to green space, or maybe you simply don't have the network or community of people around you who care about it or know about it and want to get involved. So following on from my previous question, my next question is twofold. How did you both get into this work? And then what do you think are some of the biggest barriers to participating in nature recovery, which I imagine goes hand in hand with why Youngwilders exists in the first place?
Absolutely. I'll start with this one. So I started in September of 2023, so not that long ago, almost 2 years ago, doing the London Wildlife Trust Keeping It Wild traineeship. And that's a 4-month paid traineeship, and you get a full-time salary. And you do every aspect of the traineeship. So what was really cool about that is that we had intros from finance and we helped a bit with the comms, but then actually got out and did practical volunteer days and then eventually built up to leading those volunteer days. So I got to lead a couple in the woods with a really lovely volunteer group down at Sydenham Hill Woods. And then you'd step into the education side of things. So we did a lot of nature tots. We did school sessions. At the end, I ran a school session. They do a lot of work with organisations outside of the trust. So like the Dulwich Estate and Wimbledon. And so I got to engage in all of that and see how that works. And then at the end, the idea is that you're equipped with kind of all the skills across an entire kind of, at least the London Wildlife Trust, kind of medium-sized but kind of well-known conservation organisation. And then I applied for a job at the London Wildlife Trust and at Youngwilders, and then worked as the engagement officer for both, part-time until I went on full-time with Youngwilders as the engagement lead in the new year. I was super lucky. My journey has like been very smooth, and I've been super lucky because there are tons and tons of barriers, even and especially for people who have worked in the sector already and are looking for roles, or who have studied in the sector. Often these entry-level roles they're too qualified for, but there's no kind of medium-level role, or there's such high competitiveness for them. But I would say like some of the key barriers is just like knowing what's out there. It's not a route that is like traditionally advertised when you're at school in the same way as like you could do sciences and be a doctor, or you could do maths and be an engineer. This isn't really out there. It's often like kind of lumped in with farming, which isn't quite commonly spoken about as a route. So you're not told about it. And then in terms of like actually going to volunteer, that's a whole separate thing that requires time and energy. And volunteering is unpaid, obviously. And then, yeah, physical access is just a huge barrier to accessing the outdoors. So often people are asked to work alone, which isn't safe in many instances, a lot, especially for people from underrepresented backgrounds, so people from the global majority. Being in outdoor spaces is really intimidating, really dangerous. There's lots of racism, there's lots of difficulties there. Needing access to a car, lots of jobs require you to have had a driver's license already, so you can drive to the sites that are a bit more rural. Having access to a car is often down to money and physical ability. And then places like not having any service, not seeing anyone that looks like you. Like these barriers are lessened in London, but then there's a shortage of roles in London and really high competitiveness. And there's a limitation on habitats you can learn about and the areas of specialty you can get into if you're based in London.
I feel like that's like a question in itself. But yeah, in terms of how do I get involved? Weirdly, I came at nature through reading English at university, read a lot of eco-criticism and got quite interested in kind of the classic like nature culture divide. There's quite a lot of human geographers that talk about this stuff. There's someone called Stephen Hinchcliffe who was really cool. And then, yeah, basically found massive source of solace in nature at that time. And it was 2019, which was a totally crazy year. So it was the IPCC report on 1.5 degrees and the impacts it was going to have. And it was obviously saying some pretty terrifying stuff. There were then that sparked school strikes for climate, the Extinction Rebellion. So much was happening. Brexit was happening. It felt like the world was slowly imploding, and it just felt so completely clear that that I wanted to work on climate and nature stuff, and actually was very lucky to get the grad scheme at Green Alliance, which is a nice full circle moment here, working as a comms assistant. And yeah, actually 2019 was when Isabella Tree published her book on wilding, which did have a lot of like a massive ripple effect about rewilding in general. And I think it was a brilliant book, and loads of landowners we work with are massively inspired by Isabella Tree, and we work very closely with NEP. But myself and a group of friends kind of got together, recognising that it didn't really allow space for anyone that wasn't a landowner to get stuck in, or who lived near a site to potentially volunteer. There was this real sense that if you didn't have land or money, which is often young people, there was no real clear way to get involved. And I also, when I suddenly got really hooked into nature recovery, suddenly felt like I had to go back to university and retrain and become an ecologist, which felt mad. It felt like that was a massive barrier to entry, is that suddenly I didn't know anything, or I had mass amounts of enthusiasm, energy, kind of naivety or whatever. And yeah, there wasn't really a place for that, which is exactly why we started Youngwilders as a group of friends, kind of informally at a pub in 2019. And we basically created a website, which is still in its DIY format. So apologies, everyone. It is in the process of a glow up. But we just kind of got our names out there as people who were really keen to get stuck in to rewilding projects. And that is actually how we secured our first project, is literally a landowner got in contact with us and said that she had 30 acres that she was taking from horse grazing and was really interested in rewilding, and could we help her? So that's really how Youngwilders began, was someone kind of taking a chance on us and letting us make lots and lots of mistakes. So yeah, really trying to break down those barriers that Layla mentioned and improve the number of people that can get involved.
You've just covered such a breadth of things there. I think, as you mentioned, in addition to those many barriers that exist, sometimes another big hurdle is the perception that participation isn't possible, because people may not know that organisations like yours are working to make it easier to get involved. What are some of the common misconceptions or challenges around nature recovery and ecological restoration that you continue to find yourselves coming up against?
Yeah, for sure. I think kind of what I mentioned before, but feeling like you need to know it all before you start. That was definitely a massive barrier for me, the sense of imposter syndrome or inadequacy. And don't get me wrong, if you're going to become an expert in botany and grass ID, you need to put the years in. But I think there's a ton of skills and experiences you can bring, anyone can bring to nature recovery to have a massive impact. And I think we at Young Wilders just continuously bang that drum about you don't need to know anything before you start. We're always on the lookout for incredible young nature communicators and storytellers who may have only just completed their degree or may have only just done a course on bat serving or something. But what's so obvious is that they have such an incredible passion for that subject matter. And that's enough for them to teach others who may not know anything and to kind of share that knowledge. I think, amongst other things, we don't have time to wait for this whole generation to get super skilled up on their relevant field for them to feel maybe at the age of 60 that they're finally able to speak. Like, we want to try and accelerate that level of confidence and leadership and kind of learning by doing. That's a massive thing for Young Wilders, is we get on a site and we just give it a go. Another challenge for nature recovery is shifting baseline syndrome and the vicious cycle that risks perpetuating, where young people, specifically in urban areas, but also in rural areas as well, see the nature outside their flat or their house as pretty bad. And then they, in particular, further disconnect from the natural world because the nature they do experience is poor quality, and then it's kind of vicious circle from there. So we really try in our work with young people actively resist that shifting baseline syndrome and work through dealing in wonder and enchantment and thinking about what could this green space look like and how can we as people also have an influence and impact on this space. And then, yeah, I think Layla said it perfectly, but a massive one is the sector being the second whitest behind farming, and people feeling quite strongly, and rightly so, that the countryside is often not a place for them. That's a long-term piece of work that is broader, obviously, than systemic to society, but really doing what we can to make sure that the countryside is a place for all and everyone feels welcome is definitely an ongoing challenge.
I mean, already there, you've touched on quite a few of your projects, but are there one or two active or past projects that you feel really speak to the essence of what you're trying to do and that change that you're trying to make as an organisation?
We have two projects well, we have a few projects, but two that come to mind that I'm so proud of, because I think they really kind of, like you said, capture exactly what it is we're trying to achieve. And the first is Wild Stewards, and it's a year-long traineeship program where young people who are local to one of our sites, so we have a series of sites across England and Wales, and young people who are within an hour of the site by car can become a wild steward for the site, and they will be a wild steward for a whole year. And that's a paid role where they commit 1 day a month of work in whatever form. So sometimes that can be practical, and that can be physical. So, that can be going and removing invasive species, or it can be going and surveying some grass and using quadrats, or it can be done online. So you can be writing up reports, or you can be helping contribute to writing for a bid for funding for the site. These young people are becoming more and more familiar with their area, their patch of land, their patch of grass, as it were, and then can see it change over the seasons and feel really committed and invested to it. And then hopefully share that with other young people through our volunteer days and through the conversations they're having and the roles that they're taking on. It's a paid role, but also it has really low commitment. So you don't have to give up a whole job to do it. It works really well for people who already have jobs and don't want to give up, or are already on one track for something. Some of our wild stewards are teachers, some of them work in nature comms. And then the other Second project that we work really hard on is overgrowth. So we run 2 youth summits a year. So this year we've done it up at Wilds in Northumberland National Park, which is a large rewilding estate, and then down at Nep, which is also another large rewilding estate down in Sussex that Molly already mentioned. And what's really cool there is that, well, Jack, one of my colleagues, always phrases it like we're rewilding hearts and minds. And the idea is that it's like completely untraditional ways of connecting with nature. So we don't do practical conservation. When we're there, we have panels with young people. So last year at NEP, we had young people who are already kind of early into the sector, getting up and chatting about what it's like, being really relatable for all the other people, talking about what it's like to be neurodiverse in the sector. We have like field skills sessions, we call them wayfinders. So we make that related to the habitat we're in or the local habitat that we're near. And we have our world opening workshops, which are completely untraditional ways of connecting with nature. Some kind of making batteries from algae. I'm always phrasing that wrong, but that was like a really cool session. Or connecting to marine mammals through lessons on Black feminism, which is this really awesome book. And the really cool thing about that is that we can bring together a larger group of young people between like 80 and 100. And it's all led by young people. So when we say young people, we're talking 80 to 30. So as a team, we're all 18 to 30, but then all the people on the panel or the people running the workshops are attendees, but they're also young people who are teaching, and then they get paid for that as well. We absolutely love our overgrowth youth summits. So yeah.
I guess moving on a little bit from the specifics of the work you do, I wanted to look at the youth participation and engagement side of things. Young people have historically been such drivers of change and action, not just in the environment sector, but also beyond that. And I thought it would be really interesting to discuss with you the fact that just a couple of weeks ago, we saw the voting age in the UK was lowered to 16 years old, which is a huge change. At the moment, young people, in the same way everyone else is, but young people are being constantly exposed to the fact that our politics, our environment, political systems, they're more fractured and divided than ever. And we know that that makes members of the public and everyday people want to disengage with politics and distrust our systems. But I think it's really important when we're talking about this, that we're talking about the fact that a lot of those people who want to disengage are going to be young people who are our decision makers of the future. So I think it's vital now more than ever that we really try to find ways to prevent youth disengagement. And I see lowering the voting age as just one step. That's really positive toward doing that. And turning it back to you as an organisation dedicated to youth engagement, could you touch on what kind of difference you think lowering the voting age could make, both in terms of encouraging politicians to take young people's priorities more seriously, but also just in empowering young people with a stronger sense that their voices do matter?
Yeah, it's awesome. And I think you've kind of completely encapsulated it so well. We often talk about it when we're doing the Youngwilders spiel, is that there's just at its most simple, there is literally no future without buy-in from the younger generation. So we can plant a tree today, or we can plant thousands of trees today as part of large-scale rewilding projects. But unless we really connect young people to those trees and the impact that they could have on the larger ecosystem, it's kind of pointless. I think it's just the energy and new thinking and enthusiasm from young people is immense. And there's tons of evidence. There's a really good groundwork report kind of post-COVID that pointed to the fact that these young people who really see climate nature as top priority and are desperate to do something about it, there was something like 3/4 of them felt that they weren't being adequately listened to on these topics. So lowering the voting age and really recognising that their voices matter is huge. I think that was simply put, but this really is a question of justice as well, because it is young people that will deal with the consequences of the environmental decisions being made today. So giving them ability to have influence and input into decision making is for us a question of justice.
Picking up on what you said there about the energy and enthusiasm that young people can bring to nature recovery, what are some of the other standout lessons that you've taken away from working in these youth-led spaces?
All the young people who come to our events, almost all of them are really politically engaged and really focused on social justice as well as they are on justice for the environment. And I think that kind of what we've learned is that the two are just so intrinsically interlinked and there's no way of untangling that. And so when you're talking about larger social justice issues like Palestine, for example, lots of young people are also talking about how that connects to the work we do when it comes to rewilding and like connecting to nature. So I think the biggest lesson there is that it's like everything is linked to nature, everything we do, whether you are like a therapist or a designer or an engineer, everything you do can be linked to nature and climate, and everything, all the work we do can be to the benefit of nature and then the future of the planet.
I'd really like to go further into that point, actually, and the idea, we did touch on it earlier, but the idea that a lack of green space can be an issue of equality and justice. How do you practically engage and reach out to those young people who might not feel naturally connected to nature or might not feel like it's a space where they can share their experiences?
Yeah, I mean, as you said, like a lack of access to green spaces is a broader issue of equality. We know that having more high quality green spaces means that you have access to cleaner air, so you're breathing cleaner air. It has access to regular nature, improves health outcomes. There's studies that say after surgeries, people recover quicker with access to green spaces. It lowers stress hormones, it boosts mental health. There are more people in cities who are at risk of these adverse health outcomes and other negative side effects of being marginalised, or other negative consequences of being marginalised. So to engage young people who might not feel connected, well, they need to know about it. There's organisations like Sustainably Muslim that focus specifically on having events that are focused around getting more Muslim people outside in nature and into nature conservation. So there are ways that it can be done, but it's about being really conscious and making a specific effort to think about what the barriers are for young people who are living in cities, whether that be transport, whether that be not knowing the space is welcoming to them, not knowing the space even exists, and then tackling that directly. I think the best thing you can do is to hone in on a specific thing and then ask the demographic of people who want to engage with nature but maybe find it difficult or are not doing it. What is it that we can do to help you get outside and engage more in nature? And then they'll tell you, people tell you exactly what they want and need, and you don't have to guess, and they'll tell you themselves. Yeah,
That's such wise advice, and there's a lot to reflect on there. I think it's a good moment to step back and look at the policy side of things. At Green Alliance, we're focused on how we can solve some of these challenges through the lens of policy, which we know plays a key role in shaping how nature recovery can happen at scale, from funding land management schemes to community support. We also know, and a lot of our research highlights, that behaviour change can influence policy from the bottom up. So I'd be keen to hear how you see everyday actions and bottom-up approaches connecting to bigger environmental wins.
I actually was really inspired. I went to a Green Alliance event on the Descriptor review with Fiona Reynolds and Maya Rose Craig, who's Bird Girl. And I think it was just really telling that one of the main kind of actions that came out of an event is largely about policy and kind of natural capital and nature finance framing, was that none of this was going to work. All of these ways to influence banks and do large scale nature financing, none of it was going to work without an attitude shift across the board on how people perceive and understand and connect to nature. So that was really encouraging for us for the work we do at Youngwilders, because we literally are all about that. I think if we just follow like a really logical step-by-step process of someone who comes to a Youngwilders event or someone who does an act of care for nature, it doesn't have to be at one of our events, so for example, plant a tree. They go plant a tree. For a myriad of reasons, they might have come, they might have been dragged along by a friend, or they might have felt a bit anxious, or they might have wanted to do something different. That spending time outside, doing an act of care for nature, likely will make them feel physically good and mentally better, potentially. They might feel a sense of joy from having spent time with like-minded people, or just spent time outside, or just done something different. And it might lead to a sense of connection to nature as a whole, or potentially this local green space. I do feel like we have this innate connection as children to nature. You start to reconnect with that sense of connection to nature and understand that it's not rocket science, that like a tree provides tons of benefits. It provides shade, it provides shelter, it provides cooling benefits, it helps with air quality, stuff like that. And I think from there, once you've understood the basics, you can then understand, okay, wait, this is where my food potentially might come from, or how my clothes, like the materials for my clothes are made. And I think that understanding of the impact we have on the natural world and the huge benefits and things that the natural world brings to us helps you to make sense of kind of larger, more macro scale environmental challenges like climate change, which feels huge and kind of untangible and really difficult to grasp, I really think nature can be a really brilliant anchoring force for that. And yeah, I said obviously Green Alliance agrees, Youngwilders agrees, there needs to be systemic change on how we kind of create policies around nature and the incentives we put in. But I do have a big belief in everyday actions of these kind of bottom approaches, helping to connect the dots and to understand the kind of systemic change required and be able to understand it on a kind of local person level.
Yeah, absolutely. And if we stay on this topic, do you have ideas of how policies could better support and actually work alongside grassroots organisations like Youngwilders? Are there any specific policies you'd like to see changed or implemented to do that?
So I'm going to answer this question from a young people lens, if that's all right. And I'll just say the clearest and most frequent feedback we get from young people is that the nature sector needs to be somewhere where they can forge rewarding, reliable, and financially sustainable careers. And that's not potentially possible at the moment. And so I think to make that happen, we need to ensure internships or requirements for extensive volunteering in the sector, unpaid volunteering, become a thing of the past, and create and do our best to create more entry-level positions for young people. I think also policies need to make real waves to enable young people from ethnically minoritized and low-income backgrounds see a career in nature as a place for them. And I think, yeah, linked to the point we were just making about the importance of just getting outside, creating those moments and those opportunities for young people to do that, to get outside and gain experience in nature, are such important starting points and springboards for which they can then unleash their whole hosts of talent, skills, enthusiasm, energy into the nature sector. I think we always do a big shout out to London Wildlife Trust's Keeping It Wild traineeship, which Layla mentioned, because it was really been a step change for the number of young people in London specifically entering the sector. And it really was a source of inspiration for our Wild Steward programme, which is kind of across England and Wales now.
I have one final question, which I'm hoping will bring all of these themes together. Looking ahead, what excites you most about the future of nature recovery and the role young people will continue to play in shaping that and responding to the wider environmental crisis?
Yeah, I think it kind of has already been said throughout our chat today, but the key thing is that young people are the future of nature recovery and that we're the ones who are inheriting the planet. And we all want to live in a thriving ecosystem. What we're seeing is that young people, just as I've already said, see everything as interconnected and see everything that we do and we buy has an impact on the planet, that like resources don't just disappear. They do end up somewhere, and usually often in regions of the world where people are most affected by increasing global temperatures. So I'm most excited to keep seeing young people bringing their skills and whatever they may be into the sector without having to need to change careers and come straight into the environmental sector, but continue doing what they love and are passionate about whilst also having a positive impact. And yeah, it's, I think, brilliant to continue to be inspired by campaigners who are showing us that everything is interconnected and putting a voice to what young people are thinking and feeling. So people like Greta Thunberg and Dominique Palmer, who are just talking about like what's happening across the world and campaigning for that, is really inspiring lots of young people. So it's really exciting to continue to see more people's voices be amplified from across the world.
So much to reflect on there. And from our chat today, it is really nice to end on a note of hope and positivity, but there are also so many actions that people can take away from this discussion. So thank you so much, both of you, for providing your insights and speaking with me today. Thank you for listening to this episode. Keep checking in as we continue to bring you specialist interviews and highlights from our events here on your podcast feed. You can subscribe on your favourite podcast app, and you can follow us at Green Alliance UK on X and Green Alliance on LinkedIn and Blue Sky. We encourage you to use the hashtag Green Alliance Podcast, to join in on this conversation and share thoughts, questions, and ideas. See you next time.